Hi there, welcome to Hud's History. This is the second part of the Great War. So if you've watched the first video on the first part of the Great War, then this is the continuation. So we are in the middle of the World War One, where we have the two sides, the Central Powers and the Triple Entente, who are going against each other. We know that Germany has used the Schlieffen Plan. We know that Austria-Hungary has attacked Serbia, and that the Russian Empire has come in and then using France and England as allies to attack from the west. So this video is going to show you how it basically turns into a more broad global battle. So if you're ready, here we go. We know that the Russians were having a hard time fighting on the Eastern Front. Not that they didn't have a lot of people to fight, but they were very behind industrially. We know that their industrialization had come very late, so they needed a lot of supplies. And they couldn't get them because they were being blocked. They're being blocked in the north by the Germans on the Baltic Sea. They're being blocked in the south by the Ottoman Empire, who comes in on the side of the Central Powers. So they can't get any of the materials they need through the Black Sea. The Allies over in the West, the Brits and the French, they realized that they need to find a way to get some supplies to the Russians if they can. They decided that if they could take what was known as the Dardanelles, which is a strait that goes into the Black Sea, if they could take that over and defeat the Turks, they'd be able to get their supplies into the Russians, who could then use those to fight against the Austro-Hungarian Empire as well as the Germans. So the French and the British use not just their own troops, but they bring in troops from other places. So other places are going to become part of it. The soldiers from the colonies or territories that are controlled by them, that would be places like New Zealand and Australia, even India. So this battle is going to be known as the Battle of Gallipoli, and it's going to start in February of 1915. So you have these troops from basically, other parts of the world coming into what is the territory controlled by the Ottoman Turks. As you can see, this is a battle. It's a weird desert battle, but starts on the water because they have to land in order to get there. But when they do, it's a whole bunch of desert terrain. It's not like they're just landing on some grand luscious island like, in Hawaii or something. But they have a huge landing, and they're going to try to make their way inland and try to start take over some of the territory of the Turks. The problem is that they don't get very far. Uh, as you can see on this map, the green represents the Ottoman Turks, the red represents the Allies. And by May of 1915, so we're about 3 months into the battle, they're not getting very far. Why? Because the Ottoman Turks hold the higher ground and the Allies can't basically get off the shores. This is going to continue on. There's a lot of loss of life, especially for the Brits and for their territories of New Zealand and Australia. A lot of those officers come and try and fight. They do a lot of trench warfare fighting. They go over the top, and they're basically just mowed down by the Ottoman Turks because of the positioning. So we get to December of 1915, and at that point, there's just so much loss by the Allies that they have to give up and they have to evacuate what's remaining. The total loss for the Allies at this point is going to be about 250,000 men over about a 10-month period. So this ambition to try and get the supplies to the Russians is going to fail in the southern part of the Mediterranean Sea, where they thought they were going to get through to the Dardanelles to get to the Black Sea in order to reach Russia. So if you think about what effects is going to have on allies at this point, they are stuck on the Western Front. The British and the French are with the Germans. You have the Russians who are being pushed back by both the Germans as well as the Austro-Hungarians. And you've had this major defeat of the Allies by the Ottoman Turks in the Dardanelles. So if you think about what the effect is, it becomes pretty substantial. So the Allies had lost a big battle at Gallipoli. There's going to be some help coming. and that's going to be in the form of the Americans. Now, the United States had not really joined. They were kind of staying as an isolationist group. They really didn't want to get involved. They thought it was the affairs of Europe that they need to deal with themselves. But then things start to happen on the seas that involve the United States, and that's going to start to become a big part of why the Americans will eventually join. By the time you get to 1917, which is about 3 years in the war, the seas had become a very big focus of fighting, right? Germany had tried to put a blockade around the British. They had declared that they would sink any of the ships going towards Britain, no matter who it was. This is known as unrestricted submarine warfare because they did not restrict themselves to taking on either British or French ships. Now, battling at sea had become a very big part of wartime throughout history. We know that the British had created a huge navy that helped to conquer a lot of territory over the world, and they tried to use their navy at this point to basically get the upper hand at sea. Both Germany and Great Britain tried to control the seas around Europe. We know that Great Britain created a blockade of the ports that were under German control. It's called the Hunger Blockade. And Germany and its allies, they couldn't get any supplies through like those particular ports and had to go through countries who were considered neutral during the war. But unfortunately, because of that, you pay a much higher cost because of the way you have to get them to the countries. You can't just bring them in and through ports. You usually have to go through another country, which means you have to transport them through the land, some sort of land transportation, usually railroad. So that becomes a very high cost for the Germans while they're also paying for this war. Then Germany tries to control the shipping lanes to Great Britain, and they use what are known as U-boats. These are underwater boats, otherwise referred to as submarines. These boats had a new weapon. They were, of course, torpedoes, and what they would do is they would take on different ships that were coming over towards Europe and heading towards Great Britain. Most of these ships were in great danger no matter who they were sailing for, and the British strategy was to try and defeat them. So what they would do is send one merchant ship at a time so the U-boats couldn't find them. Unfortunately, this strategy does not work very well, and they take down a lot of the merchant ships. The U-boats themselves were a new type of technology. The Germans were the first to use them, and they will end up sinking about 3 million tons of shipping. Unfortunately, because of the way the technology was, it wasn't perfected, and the U-boats could only go so far underwater because of the pressures, and they hadn't figured out the pressurization system yet. Over 50% of sailors on U-boats died. So even though the Germans used them to great effect on the seas, they lost a lot of sailors in the course of the battles. And you can see here, this is a U-boat that is in dry dock after being basically damaged by Allied ships. The impact that the U-boats are going to have is, of course, you're going to destroy the ships, whether they're merchant ships or they're military ships, lots of loss of life. And of course, you're going to see the tensions on the seas, because if you are just some basic merchant for some other country not involved in war, you are going to be fearful that you might be sunk by a German U-boat. And as you can see, this is a picture of sailors. They are abandoning a sinking ship as it lists forward and then is going to go under. The biggest incident that comes about because of the U-boats is the Lusitania incident. The Lusitania incident happens in May of 1915. That's when this German U-boat sinks a British passenger ship. It's called the Lusitania. The Germans claimed that there was weapons on this ship going towards Britain. The Brits and the Americans are like, this is a passenger ship and it is just moving people. They thought that this was a horrific, incident, because 1,200 people died, including some very prominent U.S. citizens who were on the ship. It's later found to be out that Yes, they did have weapons in the cargo, although for the most part there were mostly civilians on there, but the civilians didn't really know that they were also transporting these weapons to Great Britain. The Americans are outraged, of course. President Wilson sends his message to Germany and says basically, hey, we're not part of the war effort, so if you keep on attacking us, you may provoke the United States into war. Germany agrees because they don't need the United States coming in on the side of the Triple Entente. So they stop attacking neutral and passenger ships and only focus on basically military ships. But in 1917, they go right back to their unrestricted submarine warfare, and they will end up sinking 3 American ships. That, combined with one other thing, is going to basically tip the balance of power in this war. Officials actually intercept a telegram that's going from Germany to Mexico. It's actually intercepted by British intelligence, and it's given to the American intelligence system. This is what's called the Zimmerman's Note. And the Zimmerman Note is that Germany had told Mexico that if they came into the war on the side of the Central Powers and would take on the United States, that at the end of the war, once the Central Powers won, and Mexico being part of the Central Powers at that point, they would gain back their land that they had lost to the United States previously in the Mexican-American War. So that is the whole idea. Unfortunately, the press gets a hold of the Zimmerman Note and they publish it to the public. And that basically just angers the public, and they're like, okay, we have to get involved now because they were threatening the United States. And most people have some sort of connection to Europe through their ancestors as well. So on April 2nd, 1917, President Wilson asked Congress to declare war on Germany. They do, and the U.S. will enter the war on the side of the Triple Entente, or the Allies. And then Germany, of course, declares war on the United States. And of course, then Austria-Hungary declares war on the United States, and the Ottoman Empire declares war on the United States, and the United States declares war on everybody that's not for them. So now you have the United States coming in, and they're going to be very helpful to the Triple Entente. Why? Why does this help change the balance of power? Because you've been in a rut in the Western Front, and in eastern part of the war, you had the Russians who couldn't get any supplies and were very much faltering at the hands of the Germans and the Austrians. So now that you have the United States involved, you are seeing this total commitment to war. And this is what's known as the war effort, where the state basically changes all manufacturing to accommodate winning a war. That will include rationing goods so that people can only buy so much at a given time so that they had enough for the soldiers. And this goes on as well during World War II. Very famous, if you ask your grandparents or great-grandparents, they had ration books where they could only get certain things on certain days based off what they had in their little book. Now, Russia is in the middle of this war, but they will end up leaving the war. They don't get defeated necessarily. Well, not externally anyway. There's a growing frustration within Russia. There is civil unrest because of things that are going on. And if you go to the Russian Revolution video, it'll explain everything there, but it's too hard to try and put all what happens in Russia at this point into this part of the war. So it's a whole separate video, so just go watch it when you have a chance. But the civil unrest will finally lead Tsar Nicholas to stepping down, and a provisional government will come into place. Unfortunately, the provisional government doesn't do very well, and there is a bigger revolution, which will eventually lead to having a new leadership, a new government controlled by the communist Bolsheviks, who are led by Vladimir Lenin. So Vladimir Lenin will take power in November of 1917, and then realizes that they don't need to deal with this war anymore. And in 1918, they offer a truce with Germany, and they sign what's known as the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk. and that ends the war between the Russians and the Germans. They'll also sign an agreement with the Austro-Hungarian Empire. In this agreement, they lose some of their land, which after World War I will become part of Poland and some other places. But they decide to leave, give up some land in order to maintain what they believe is a strong Russian state, and they'll become the Soviet Union. Well, now that you have the Russians out, the Germans can focus just basically on the West. But unfortunately, they now have to deal with not only the Brits and the French, but they also have to deal with the Americans. And the Americans are just ready to go into battle, and they send a ton of soldiers coming in. The Germans start to mount more attacks. They get to the River Marne in France, and they thought that victory was in reach. The problem is that they were basically depleting themselves of so many soldiers because the battle had gone on for 4 years now. And now you have 140,000 new US soldiers, cowboy types that are ready to go, and they are going to counterattack these Germans at the Battle of Marne. So you have a second Battle of the Marne in which the Germans become defeated, and that's going to lead to the Germans being pushed back again by these allies. You have this last big push by the Americans, the British, and the French. It is the Battle of the Argonne Forest, and it happens in September 1918. And as they go through it, there are a lot of different weapons used, including flamethrowers, as well as gases. So the last major offensive happens here, and they will eventually push the Germans backwards, and that will lead to the end of the war in 1918. Why does this happen? Well, because 2 million more US soldiers arrive to fight. Germany's allies, they begin to fall. First, it was Bulgaria, who had come in on the side of the Central Powers, and then the Ottoman Turks collapse. In October of 1918, the Austro-Hungarian Empire had become very weak, and revolution sweeps through, taking down the Habsburg family. Finally, the German soldiers kind of get tired because the public is turning against the war, and so they mutiny against the Kaiser, who is Wilhelm II. And this leads to a series of actions where you will see Kaiser Wilhelm step down. Then a new government is formed by the Germans. They decide to meet with the French near Paris, and they decide to sign an armistice to take effect. This armistice means that there will be no more fighting, and they will find a way to peacefully end these conflicts. The agreement takes place on the 11th hour of the 11th day of the 11th month of 1918. So at 11 a.m. local time on November 11th of 1918, World War I basically comes to an end. It's known as the 11th hour. Of course, the Allies, or the Triple Entente as they're known, they win. The armistice is signed. Germany is forced to quit, and you now have the task of basically trying to figure out what to do with Europe, because there are all these issues from this war. What is the legacy of the war itself? Well, obviously, it was a new kind of war, right? We've never seen this type of fighting with trench warfare. There's new technologies that you have in here, things like the machine gun tanks. You have the use of airplanes for the first time. You have flamethrowers. You have these gases like mustard gas and chlorine gas being used as weapons. This is a war on a global scale because it's not just this part of the world that's being affected. It's being affected by colonies of the Europeans. It's being affected by these other countries who come and get involved that are not part of Europe. There's enormous loss of life. It has a great economic impact on Europe itself. I mean, you have to think about how much money was spent in order to build these militaries, and then how much economic damage is done because of the loss of trade and whatnot. They're going to eventually come to a peace agreement. That's in the video called the Treaty of Versailles. So you can watch that video and see what that's all about. But that peace agreement is going to affect Europe for years after the end of what is known as the Great War. So we're now at the end of the Great War, or World War I. So that in a nutshell is World War I, or the Great War, and how it expanded from the European continent all the way over to a global conflict with other countries coming in from outside the continent to help out. So if you like the video, make sure that you like it. You can subscribe so you can see other videos that are on my channel or other ones that I will create. My social tip for the day is to honor yourself, know your value, know your worth, and don't let anybody take that away from you. So until next time, this has been HUD's History. Peace out. See you next time.